You have to get out a lot of bad writing to be able to get to the good writing. Poetry isn't about outrage, it's about the truth. I don't think AI could ever replace artists because the human connection that artists bring is too important.
This is the LOAF Podcast. Welcome back to the bakery, everyone, where we break bread with the world's finest. Today, we are so lucky to be joined by Nikita Gill. Ollie and I are in the studio today with the famous Instagram and published poet. Miss Gill, thank you so much for being with us here today. Is it okay if we call you Nikita?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This is fantastic.
Yeah, so Nikita, you came to the Union last year to a poetry symposium that I organized, and you read there with another artist, Savannah Brown. And I was wondering, looking back, what that experience was like.
I think that was definitely one of my favorite nights it was 2022, wasn't it? That was definitely one of my favorite nights of 2022. It was really my favorite part of the evening. I love Savannah and I think she's amazing. And I love doing readings myself, but I really loved listening to the students read. Like, I thought that was so powerful because I could see that I think a few of them told me that they had never performed before, but you would never guess that when you watch them perform on stage. And I think what was really lovely at the end of the evening was to be able to talk to everybody who performed and kind of just get to know a little bit more about where their poetry was coming from. Because I think the thing with poetry is it is so personal and it comes from such a vulnerable place. And it's almost like painfully honest that you need to know sometimes you want to know the person behind the piece to really add more context to the piece as well. And I thought that was really, really special to be able to talk to everybody who performed afterwards. So yeah, I love that.
Thank you.
So before we get into, we're already touching on some pretty good topics, but just before we get into that, as a poet, I thought we should start with one of the most poetical subjects, and it's the title of our podcast. So we wanted to ask you your favorite bread.
Oh my God. Okay. That's, I'm gonna say it's a tiger loaf. Okay. I love it. I think that the tiger loaf is my favorite because it is just the right consistency of thickness for a really good camembert. Like you bake a great camembert and it's the best consistency for that. So yeah, that I definitely a tiger loaf. Also, there's a really funny story behind the tiger loaf. You must have heard this story.
Not at all. No, go ahead.
So apparently, the tiger loaf was originally something that Sainsbury's had named the giraffe loaf. And this little girl kind of went to visit them and she said, well, it doesn't look like a giraffe. It looks like a tiger, the markings. And they actually changed the name of the bread.
Right. Really?
I thought that was such a cute story.
You know, that's funny you say that because I'm pretty sure when I was at school, we would go to like Sainsbury's every single day. This is like 5-6 years ago, maybe. I'm pretty sure I was having giraffe baguette. So maybe she changed it since then. So that's pretty funny.
Well, maybe I have it wrong. Maybe it's the other way around. But yeah, it was one of those stories. I thought it was a really funny story that they actually, well, it's nice when they listen to children, right? Because children are pretty on point when it comes to stuff like that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, it's always such good stories that we get when we ask guests about their favorite bread. We asked one guest, Matthew Johnson, about his favorite bread, and he was telling us how when he was younger, it was like sliced bread with crisps stuffed in it, and it's brilliant to hear everyone's own experiences.
Everybody loves a good crisp sandwich. Yeah,
exactly. So you came to Oxford to speak, so this is an Oxford University podcast, and as Oxford students facing the tough work grind and having our own fair share of writing block on late night essays, we're wondering how you deal with writer's block as an artist. I write some poetry myself, and it's a really big hurdle and can often lead to a lack of motivation. How do you deal with that?
I'm actually going through like some pretty major writer's block on two separate projects for two completely separate reasons right now. And the big thing that I've learned with writer's block is it's not only like an individual thing, like, different writers get blocked over different things, but it's also per project. It can be entirely different. So one of the projects I'm working on is for a really prestigious institution. And the thing which is blocking me is the last person who wrote for that institution was Seamus Heaney. And that's some very big shoes to fill. So it's the last poet that they had worked with 25 years ago was him. And like, it's very hard to kind of go, well, they've picked you for a reason. They like your work for a reason. They don't want you to write like Seamus Heaney. They want you to write like yourself. So that was a big barrier to break through. It's like, how do you follow up someone who's larger than life? And the way that I've kind of been breaking through that barrier is constantly reminding myself in the mornings before I start working. So I work on this project first thing in the morning when my brain doesn't have the time to start listening to my inner critic. So before I can listen to my inner critic, I've already started work on the project. So a lot of like the good writing on this project happens then. And the second project I'm working on is a book which is a sequel. Like it's a sequel poetry collection to one of my earlier books. And I've never written a sequel before. And that is such a block for me because I'm like, it's a first time. It's the first time I'm writing a sequel. And everyone, there's that saying, right? The sequel is never as good as the first. And I've got that block in my head kind of going, oh God, like, do I make it enough like the first book that people kind of look at it and go, this was such a good continuation of the first book? Or do I just go extremely crazy and just make it quite different, but just with similar themes? So there's, as Robert Frost said, there are two roads that I could take. There are two paths. And I'm stuck because I don't know which path to take. So finally, what I've decided is I'm just going to listen to my creative brain and just make it as crazy and free as possible instead of trying to make it, trying to stick to a traditional rule that I've set for myself with that first book. So I think with writer's block, you kind of have to identify the source of the problem because every writer's block is happening for a completely different reason. And when you identify the source of the problem, whether it's like tiredness, whether it's, I don't think I can do it, whether it's a confidence thing, whether it is a personal block because you're writing about something quite vulnerable, it depends on the reason. And then to write your way out of that reason, I would say free write. Like you don't have to write about the thing that you're blocked on, but just start free writing. Even if you're saying like, I have writer's block like 20 times, 30 times on a page, just free write your way out of it because it's the only way to get through it. Like they say, right? You can't go over it. You can't go under it. The only way is through it. Writer's block is like that. The only way is like going through it and identifying the problem. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think people have such an image of poetry as like, there's sort of no expectations placed upon you. You're completely free to kind of do whatever you want. But in a weird way, you kind of have your own expectations impinging upon you. I was going to ask, that must be so different from the corporate world, which you transformed over from before you became a full-time poet, where you have very rigid structures, you can't get writer's block. You just know what you have to do. So very rigid expectations from people. How did you find that adjustment over? What liberties do you have now? Is there anything you miss?
I think people have this idea that when you move from like a corporate, quite traditional space to like this very free space with creativity and so much freedom, that is quite an easy transition, but it's not, because the human beings respond very well to structure. And what a corporate job does is that it gives you that structure. It gives you the 9 to 5. You have someone you have to answer to. In a lot of ways, it takes the responsibilities of setting your own work it takes it away from you. You know what you're doing. You can almost work in like robot mode. And that's the thing that I used to hate because it used to limit my creativity. But the minute I got the freedom to be able to explore, it's almost like I was like a deer in the headlights going, oh my God, I can do anything I want. I can create anything I want. Where do you begin? It's the fear of the blank page. And I think the real beauty was finding my own structure within the freedom. And it's taken a long time to develop that. It sometimes takes an artist like 10 years to find the thing that really works for them. But for me, it was very much, I wake up in the morning, I read, I free write, and I do like 3 morning pages before I get into my actual writing. And my morning pages are just, they say that you have to get out a lot of bad writing to be able to get to the good writing. So the morning pages are that. They're like the crap, the nonsense in my head, the compulsive thoughts, the anger, the grief, whatever I'm carrying from the previous day, I put that in, and then I start afresh on my work. And usually the hardest project first, so the hardest thing I have to do, I try to get rid of it to start with, and then I move on to the other things. But it took a long time to find a structure that worked for me, right down to the kind of notebooks I like to write in, the kind of pens I like to use, the kind of equipment I enjoy. And it's, if I don't get, Stephen King does this very interesting thing. The first thing what he does when he gets up at about 5 a.m. is he goes for a walk for an hour, So every writer has their own way, their own structure of dealing with things, but that structure takes a long time to develop. Like you can't just, I think people think that once you publish your debut and your debut is successful, that's it. You've got it made or something like that. But when you're a debut novelist or a debut poet, or you've just done your first book, you suddenly start worrying about that second book. And that structure really helps with the second book, because your first book, you write in an abyss or a void. You write it without thinking about the expectations. You write it without thinking about, who's waiting for this book. And so you kind of write it in a very haphazard way. And there's a really beautiful flow to every debut book that you will ever read, every debut chapter. And I love those flows, because that flow is like the rawness of the writer's voice and the spirit, right? And the second book has to have the structure and the things that you've learned. So I do think you spend a long time developing that as a writer, and it really depends on where you come from. I think I'm one of those people who believes very strongly in discipline when it comes to write. I have to write every day. If I'm not writing something every day, I feel like I'm losing grips on my craft. So yeah.
That's so
I don't know if
interesting.
I answered your question, but yeah.
I think you answered the question really well. And just following from that, you mentioned the different tools that you have, your pen, Stephen King goes on a walk. And there's all these different tools that an author has when they're coming up with the creation. And what's really interesting is in our age, we now have social media, and your Tumblr, in your case, as it's starting to truly take off. And now we're really feeling these effects of social media. And you're arguably best known for your work on Instagram. And I was wondering, is it harder? Is it easier? What are these differences from the time of Seamus Heaney now to these days where we've got social media as a new tool in the toolbox?
I would say in a lot of ways, I think it's harder. Because there's so many platforms now. So when I have a lot of friends from back in my Tumblr days, and we always talk about the best thing about Tumblr was that it was a very chilled platform. You could put up anything you wanted, and you wouldn't know what took off, because social media used to be so much more of a democratic space then. It was pre them developing these algorithms. Everything was very chronological. So you shared something, whoever was online at the time would see it, and they would share it or whatever, Now things have become so much more complex and so much more opaque, I would say. With gatekeepers, and I've always railed against gatekeepers, at least that, okay, they're gatekeepers. This is the kind of stuff they expect. With social media algorithms, you don't know what they're pushing. You know that they're going to push the stuff that gets the most engagement. And most of the time that is outrage content. And I've had to spend a lot of time thinking, where does poetry fit into that? Because poetry isn't about outrage. It's about the truth. and often very uncomfortable truths, but they're not there to provoke anger out of you at anything other than injustice, And I think there's like a whole journey which I've kind of gone on where I'm very ambivalent about social media now. So I'm like, on one hand, I wouldn't have my career and where I am now without it. But on the other hand, I'm like, is this actually good for artists, for social media companies to have such a chokehold on what goes with art and what works with art? And I think I have a friend who talks very beautifully about this. Her name is Trista Mateer. She's also a poet. But Trista basically says that every time some of us, which is like, working class poets or immigrant artists, or people who aren't usually represented, we make it through, they kind of put up the walls behind us. And that's kind of how I see social media algorithms. I'm kind of really sad for the next generation of artists because they deserved the same democratic platform. But it's just not the same as it used to be. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you so much about the algorithm. Even for me as like a consumer, I find so much, if I'm interested in something, it's coming up already. And for people there's such a confirmation bias with that, where people will like a certain kind of poetry or the kind of poetry from somebody from their socioeconomic class. They don't want their ideas challenged. And there's such a barrier there. You're right. So how do you think these sorts of, going beyond social media, how do you think these barriers to the getting into the arts world can be addressed? Say for like you say, working class, disadvantaged people. How do you think we can work at like readdressing that?
Do you know, the good thing about the UK, because obviously I came from India, is that there are a lot of things like grants available to artists here. Of course, over the last 13 years, things have become far more difficult and far more challenging because of the cuts that have been put on, say, the Arts Council and these grants and things like that. But I still think that one of the best things in the world is when artists support other artists. And this is a community. The poetry world is a community. And the best support that I have received as an artist is from other artists. And I think making that network stronger, and not via social media, but like creating a network of people who are like you, who are artists or poets or writers, and then growing together. That's kind of how like so many of us grew from Tumblr. Like a lot of the well-known poets today on social media, we did all grow from Tumblr together. We all know each other and we all supported each other, we shared each other's work. And I think that word of mouth and that support and the mentoring, of like an older poet mentoring a younger poet, those are the things that we can put into place as individuals to help and building that community. But I do think the arts needs money. And to be able to get that money, we need to break the chokehold that tech companies have on the arts right now. So, and that's a bigger conversation. There's a great book called Choke Point Capitalism. And one of the authors of that book is Cory Doctorow. And he talks about how tech companies have basically captured creative labor markets and how we can take them back. And it's a great book if you want to read further into that question. It's one of my highest recommended books. So, yeah.
That's brilliant. So it seems clear from what you've said and from my experience as well that social media and tech is changing the way that we view and consume poetry and art. But I think what's an even more interesting question is if you think social media has changed the way poetry is written.
Yeah. See, it's not the fault of the poets to a great extent, and it's certainly not the fault of any artist who does this. But one of the things I talk a lot about, especially in schools when I visit, is an art, and it's a running joke online actually amongst artist communities, that you take 5 minutes to write like a thought, a scribble, right? And that goes viral. But the piece that you took months to write or months to create or that doesn't do as well. Now, psychologically, what does that do to the artist who spent the hours writing that piece, but then found the thing that he wrote or made in 5 minutes going viral? It tells him that you should make more of those 5-minute pieces, and what does that say on a larger scale about the arts? What does that say? What is that going to do to the next generation of artists? Like, we're not going to really know the damage of that algorithmic, pressure for at least another 10 years, and it's something which I'm writing a lot of like essays around digital existentialism. And, because obviously I'm in a good position to talk about it because my career depends on it. And the ambivalence and the pain of knowing that what the next 10 years are going to look like for the arts because of this algorithmic pressure and the performance that you have to do on social media, because people also want you to be really authentic, but it's also your business. So how do you separate the personal from the business side of things? It's very hard to do. And artists are kind of stuck in the middle of all of that. So
that is really difficult. And you speak about it so clearly. You have experience in it, and it's really great to hear it from you. I mean, like you said, your livelihood does depend on it. And to touch on something which is very current and also a little bit sensitive, especially in the field of the arts, even us as we do graphic design, even we, so Ollie and I feel it, the rise of AI. How do you think that is going to change the future of poetry, online poetry? For example, as you mentioned, you could spend months on a poem that AI simply cannot live up to. AI simply cannot replicate that, but maybe a quick scribble, maybe AI can replicate that. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I try very hard not to engage too much with the AI discourse. And I'll tell you why. It's because over the last 10 years, I've been spending a lot of time observing the way tech companies do their PR. And there's like an influx of PR around something usually where they overpromise and they plan to deliver eventually, but they need the money to be able to deliver on those things. And I think AI is very interesting because it was, what was it, like middle of last year, late last year, that suddenly we saw this like influx of articles that came in about how AI was going to destroy all the jobs. It was like the next industrial revolution. It took things so quickly to such a large peak that I was like, they're definitely doing that thing again that they did, where they tried to push through something without considering. They tried to smash regulations because they know that the people who are in power and government, a lot of them, I'm not trying to be ageist or anything like that, but did you take the time to hear the TikTok hearing in the US? Did you hear anything?
Oh, yeah, that's hilarious.
You've seen clip. Funnily enough, I saw it on TikTok, but
but the thing is, look, I am all for like tech CEOs in the sense of the TikTok hearing being dragged in to have these difficult conversations with them, like, what are you doing to protect users' data? What are you doing to protect their privacy? How is artists' content being protected from being scraped? How, I'm all for that happening, but I really want the people asking the questions to not be the kind of people who need to ask their grandchildren how to turn the Wi-Fi on. Like I feel like we are in this very pivotal moment where all of the people who are in charge don't seem to understand what the technology is, and they're the ones who are asking the questions. And that's my concern with AI, that the regulations will come. They are coming, in fact. But will the damage already be done by tech pushing something through with their PR, which is like completely deregulated? It's a much larger conversation, but I don't think AI could ever replace artists, because
I agree.
The human connection that artists bring is too important. Even with graphic design, I used to be a graphic designer. So even with graphic design, the client, you know this, the client often don't know what they want, but they think they know what they want. So you have to get in and psychologically analyze what the client actually wants, pull it out, and then give them this thing, and then convince them that actually this was the thing you originally, I know it's different from what you said, but this is what you actually wanted. And that's how I did most of my graphic design work. But you can't get a machine to do that. You just put in a bunch of commands into a machine and it'll give you exactly that. You need a human being to be able to decipher the art. It's that simple. So, yeah.
No, I completely agree. Like Lucas and I sometimes we'll just make little AI poems for the fun of it. Like we'll just give it a prompt. Like something funny happens, right? You just ask it to make a sonnet or something.
Yeah.
And it sort of works. Like it can give you a rhyme scheme and stuff, but there's something there which is always lacking. And I think you're right about that. There's that little bit of, I don't know if it's creativity or what you want to ascribe it to, but there's definitely something which I just think the technology is never going to quite get.
It's human emotion. You can't replicate human emotion, and unless it's another human being. And I know that people are under the impression that AI can pretty much do anything, but it really cannot replicate human emotion. It's a machine. You can't. That's not what art was about to start with. If I remember correctly, for years they said that the reason why AI was being built was to liberate the human masses to be able to pursue their creative pursuits. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that maybe has contributed so much to your wide appeal is compared to somebody who, for example, has like a super formalist approach to poetry or whatever, you really let emotion take the forefront. And that's something I've really enjoyed in your poetry. I read Note to Self, which I think is one of your most popular poems, and that shares a deeply personal history of trauma. Could you maybe talk to us a little bit about, and for our listeners, how personal anecdotes in your writing have helped with your journey of healing and self-discovery, and maybe how that can help other people using that emotion?
It's very hard to be so vulnerable in front of hundreds of thousands of people. But I think one of my favorite things about social media and what it gave me access to is the comment sections in all of my on all of my posts. Because what happens is when someone reads a poem and they're able to instantly respond to it, you get a very raw response. And that response is usually coming from such a place of vulnerability and pain. And I try very hard to honor that in the comment sections of my posts. And that collectiveness and that community, it really helps with healing. So when I post something which I feel quite vulnerable about, and I see a lot of people responding with, some really personal stuff, like someone will say, I shared this with my son and we were going through a really hard time at the time and it's helped our relationship. But also this is what happened between us. You kind of have to find the space to treasure that, because that is such a personal, beautiful thing another human being has given you. And this is why I think it would be so hard for AI to replicate that, that instant raw reaction to a human being creating a piece of art. There's nothing more beautiful and human than that, So I think a lot of my healing, when it comes to my work, it comes from that sense of community, that sense of collectivism.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And slightly on a more negative note, how do you then deal with sometimes the negativity that comes maybe from outside that community and can often come with an online presence? And what would your tips be for other people who are perhaps also facing this negative online presence?
So, I obviously, one of the big things with being visible is that you will be trolled. It's just how it is on the internet. It shouldn't be. In a perfect world, it wouldn't be like that. People would recognize the humanity in the person that they're talking to. But my grandfather once told me something very interesting, which is related to this tangentially. But I was talking to him about, being trolled. And I was like, I would never speak to another human being like that. I don't understand why, people are saying these things. I think it was about a death threat. And my granddad told me something very interesting. And he said, one of the things that he's in the army, to give some context to this. He retired as a lieutenant general. And he said that one of the things that I learned when I was in the armed forces is it is a lot easier to shoot someone from a great distance than it is to shoot them to their face, and that he said that it's one of the things that a lot of World War II soldiers talked about later on, when they finally had the capacity to, that when you're able to shoot someone from a distance, you're able to see them as an enemy a lot more easily because you don't have to attach a face to the person that you're shooting. But when you're up close, you can't shoot that person because they're a human being just like you. And I think it applies to social media as well. People are so far removed from seeing the other person as a human being because they're at such a far distance from them. They're in a screen somewhere, that it's a lot easier to shoot them that way or to hurt them that way. But if you were standing in front of that person, they would never speak like that to you, ever. They would recognize that you're a human being, and the social need of being polite would come first over everything. So it's important to remember that it's not about you. It never is. And that human being would never speak like that to you in real life. And I try to keep that and hold that as something which I use to protect myself. But more than that, I also am very liberal with the block button.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it's so powerful, this idea of shooting. And it reminds me of, I was once on a plane and I was near this old woman and she told me about her late husband. And it was such a powerful story about how he was in the war and how he was chatting to the enemy. I think it was the Germans, the night before, having a cigarette and chatting. And the next day he had to face him on the battlefield and they came face to face. And I think for people to spew hate on social media from a distance, I don't know if people would have the kind of guts to say it to someone else's face. So that's really powerful. And thank you for that advice.
Oh, it's from my grandfather. He's always been there's a lot of army analogies in what he says, but that one I really took with me.
Yeah. I mean, just building from that, I was wondering what advice you would give to help those struggling maybe in this world where there is a lot of negativity and maybe they're struggling to find their own voice, trapped by maybe societal expectations. How could someone begin their journey towards self-empowerment and better mental health?
That's a big question.
Yeah, I'm just sorry before you answer. I saw your poem on the hustle culture, so that's really why I thought it would be a good question to ask.
Yeah, I'm on a rampage against hustle culture right now because I don't think. The thing is, about 10 years ago, people hustling looked very different from what it looks like now. I don't think human beings were machines built to be working 16 hours a day just to put food on the table. I don't think a world that demands that of a human being is a fair world. And I don't think we were designed for that to start with. We were designed to live and not live to work, right? And what is living? Living is being able to spend time with your family, your friends, being able to rest, and not having to think about, oh, I've not been productive today. I've not done X, Y number of things today. I have a real, a gripe, which I'm going through right now. I think it's one of the things which I have to go through to get to the other side. But I think a world that pushes that is also a very ableist world. Because it doesn't consider that what human beings do is we're not young forever, or also, God forbid, something happens or you're born with a disability. I struggle with scoliosis and chronic pain. If your world doesn't make allowances for that, what kind of world have you built? Which is my question to society. And I think interrogating that within yourself and not constantly feeling like people are judging you, which is really hard to do, especially in the world of social media. Those are the two biggest things I would say for someone who's kind of looking to find their own voice. The story that you are most scared of telling, and the story that makes you the most uncomfortable and vulnerable, that's usually the story you need to tell the most. That is the voice that needs to be heard the most. And I usually say to people who are scared, especially of whether their voice would be accepted or not, that even if it changes one life or one person hears it and is different after that, you've done your job as a writer, as an artist. You've done your job. That was what you were supposed to do with that piece of work. So you're not creating, for maybe thousands of people or millions of people. You're creating for one person, yourself and that one person who needs to hear that story or voice. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think finding your voice is so much linked to empowerment and feeling that sense of worth. And I think that's something, like we say with social media, that so many young people are struggling with. And I'm really glad to have people like you on the internet, because opening up to that vulnerability is so important. And you see the other side, where when people feel that weakness, which is in all of us, they really drive to get rid of that and they seek power. And that's why you have these like hyper masculine sort of Andrew Tate figures on the internet, who people feeling not empowered try and find all the power that they can. And I think that's a much more toxic way to deal with it. I mean, obviously, but it's just an interesting contrast to draw.
I think it's very interesting. I'm very annoyed at the existence of someone like Andrew Tate, but I think to be able to really understand him, you kind of have to come to the point where you understand that the world runs on archetypes. And what he's done is he's developed himself into this archetype of someone that young boys especially should look up to. And it's all marketing. It's all based in marketing. And if you're able to crush that and kind of understand why he's become so successful, which a lot of teachers are doing now, which a lot of like parents are doing, you're able to defeat that very strong narrative, which has helped someone like that go mainstream. But it requires a lot of critical thinking, which right now I feel like, especially with like the Twitter or X as it's called or whatever, it's become in very short supply. Both nuance and critical thinking are so important when it comes to stuff like this. So, yeah.
Thank you. It's super interesting what you say about archetypes. I agree with that so much. And I think a lot of your work, what I've seen in your writing, is trying to create a better positive feminine archetype, which is the other side. And how do you go about trying to do that? I know you use mythology and all that kind of thing, but I find that super interesting that you're kind of tapping into this thing which people are supposed to aim at and making that aim, much more fulfilling and something that really empowers people.
I think a lot of my work comes from writing to a younger version of myself whilst I was growing up in India and I was facing a lot of misogyny. So what can I do to empower that girl, right? And there are a lot of young women who are in that position today who respond to the work that I'm writing towards that younger version of myself. So in a nutshell, that's where the work comes from. And that's why I think a lot of people respond to it, because how would you talk to the younger version of yourself, right? And that's, I think, with my YA poetry collection, it kind of came from that space as well. Like an auntie or a big sister kind of giving you the advice that she wished she had growing up. But like not in the patronizing voice, more in the, I understand and you are valid. And here are the tools that you need to be able to navigate this. So yeah, that's in a nutshell, that's what that is.
Oh, thank you. For someone who maybe was in a similar situation to you, or for someone who aspires to be a figure like you, what advice would you give for them to start maybe writing poetry or finding the creative voice in a purely creative sense?
So your craft is everything. Your craft is everything that will matter in the end. And I think one of the big things that I've learned over the course of time is do not let the world, I wouldn't say the world is against young writers and young poets, but it often feels that way, that the world is against you and the world doesn't want you to be an artist. They would rather want you to do like that little 9 to 5 job where, like in a corporate structure where you don't ask a lot of questions and you do what you're told. That's what it feels like, especially when you're a young artist, that is what the world asks for you. To be able to be an artist, just to be brave, incredibly brave and incredibly resilient against all of the criticism which will come to you. And you have to be prepared for that. And the only thing that can prepare you for that is the knowledge that you will grow every day that you write. Every day that you write, you will grow. And the way that you know that you have grown as a writer in your craft is the work that you look at 6 months ago after writing every single day will make you cringe because you'll be like, oh my God, this is so bad. And you're thinking this is so bad. But what you're not realizing is in that moment, you have grown so far beyond that point 6 months ago that you have become good enough to criticize yourself six months ago. And that's the way that you know as a creative person, simply as an individual, how far you've come. And that's how you measure your progress in your creativity.
Yeah, I find I have that a lot. Just in general life, you look back at a younger self, especially as a teenager, you look back at your younger self and you're like, what on earth was I doing?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's interesting. We spoke to A. Stallings. I'm not sure if you know her. She's another.
Of course, everybody knows her.
There you go. And what's really interesting is I find in your approach how you let emotion sit at the forefront and all this kind of thing, and that's reflected in free verse. I find the structure of poetry to reflect somebody's approach to it and somebody's mode of life so much. So A. Stallings, for example, who writes very formal, organized poetry, very in line with classical style. She likes to write almost like a 9 to 5. So you said, for example, that everybody just wants you to have a 9 to 5, but she writes, she has to be in a stable mood with a clear head. Do you find that as well, or do you find that you write best when you're in a moment of passion? How does it work for you?
It kind of is both. I think as I've got older, I've got more rigid about like writing between 9 to 5, only because my partner works from 9 to 5, and I like to make sure that our evenings are for us. Other than when I go and I sit down and I start writing, I get a lot of like 3 a.m. ideas and thoughts. A lot of my idea work happens at night, if that makes sense. And I think it's, again, because the tiredness stops the inner critic. Anyway, I've noticed that now I do work a little bit more like in a 9 to 5 structure, but that's more out of consideration for the person that I'm with, as well as like a need to have the downtime in the evening of like having the little routine of making dinner and like then sitting and having a conversation with the person I love. So I suppose it swings and rounds about, but I do think that I do some of my best writing on the train. So trains, 5-hour-long journey, 6 hours. I'm really looking forward to going to Edinburgh in a week because that's like a 5-hour-long journey, and I'm going to end up doing so much good writing on the train. So yeah.
Yeah, so you say you've got that more rigid structure now. I guess the train is like the antithesis of that. It allows you to break free a bit. But do you see that in your writing? Like, do you see yourself becoming a bit more structured in your writing style and stuff? Is that reflected or not so much?
Kind of. I think this year I spent a lot of time reading the classics that had a really big impact on me as a teenager. So of course, when I was a teenager, I read Dorian Gray, Frankenstein, all of those books, and they had a really big impact on the kind of work I do now, which is along the lines of mythology, pagan, kind of sci-fi, fantasy work, which I enjoy. I enjoy writing horror a lot, which I don't share very often. I don't share at all under my own name. I have a pen name for that. But I love experimentation. And I think experimentation can only happen when you take yourself out of your comfort zone. And I think that will only happen when you are like out and about somewhere. Strangely, a lot of like the best kind of writing you'll do is when you're not supposed to be writing. Like, so you're out with your friends and someone says something and you're like, that's a story. And you write it down because it's like, and you've told yourself you're not going to be working. And that's when your brain goes, actually, I think this is a great time to be creative. So you've just got to listen to what your brain is telling you, what your body is telling you to do. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
No, it's really interesting because I find so much of what you talk about in your freeform poetry is kind of like, you're always sort of breaking these boundaries. You're on the train and you're traversing, you're somewhere new, you're with your friends. The kind of metaphorical version of that is your pen name, and that you're kind of breaking out a boundary of yourself. How do you find being under that pen name affect your writing, being free from the boundary of having this name attached to you?
Oh, it's great. Like, I think what's really fantastic about writing horror is that there is a structure to it. So you wake up in the morning, and in the mornings I wake up and I'm like, I think I'm going to spend today writing some horror. The basis of it is today something terrible is going to happen to someone and I have to invent that person and that terrible thing, which is very freeing. It's very freeing. It is very freeing. It's not like I base my horror on any real people or anything who have upset me or anything like that. But yeah.
Sounds like you're admitting it there slightly.
No, but all I'm saying is that the horror under the pen name is probably one of the most freeing things you can do. And I think that's why a lot of writers do go and have pen names if they're trying to experiment in a whole new field. I have a friend who does sci-fi and they wanted to experiment in romance. So they got a pen name to write in romance because it's such a different field from sci-fi in many ways. So, and they really enjoyed it. And then they came out and they said, okay, this is, I can write, I can let people know that this is me now. So it's like one of those things a lot of the reasons why writers go for pen names is to not be burdened with the, what you've developed under your own name. And also you want to see if you can make yourself a success in a completely different field within your field, without having people read it because it's you who's written it, So that's what I really love about writing horror under a pen name is like, you're building up from scratch again, and there's nothing more fun than building up from scratch again. So, yeah.
That's brilliant. I mean, J.K. Rowling, I think, did it as well under a pen name, the same idea of starting again, seeing if you can become popular. But I think everyone knew it was her, so it defeated the purpose. But it's interesting that you mentioned horror. Is just funny because when I was like 11, the first book that I wrote, when you're a kid and you're like, oh, yeah. I always read it as well. It was called Jarut, King of Death. And it was about like people being killed by this man who was omnipotent. And it was crazy. All my friends have seen it. I was like 12 years old. And I look back, I'm like, what was going on through my head at 12 years old to be writing such horror? But I understand the feeling of freeing yourself with such horror content.
I was just going to say, I think that's amazing because that hits on something which I've always felt with horror. There's a reason why young children especially find so much joy in being scared almost. And it comes from this idea that horror or supernatural stuff, it scares you in a way that it can't happen in real life. Because when you're a kid, the world is a scary place, especially when you're a child, because you don't know a lot of the world and you're told by your parents, don't talk to strangers, don't do this, don't do that. So if you're able to write a really scary story, you feel like you've got some kind of control on it. And that's where that comes from. I think that's such a great thing to know about you, Lucas.
Thank you. You should read it. It's honestly hilarious because he obviously had a lot of stuff going on in his life at the time. I don't know what, but one of the scenes I remember was something like Jarrett, he transports into this room and then he converts his like victim, I don't know what you want to call them, his patient or whatever, into a sandwich and just eats this fat sandwich that's made out of this person whilst they're alive. It's hilarious.
I think that's how we got the name LOAF.
Do that as a film.
Yeah. I think that's now the idea of bread. Yeah, just transformed into this podcast, the LOAF Podcast. I can see the connection. But yeah, I mean, to to kind of we went off on a bit of a tangent there, talking about my past creative self. But
It's great. I am a huge fan of hearing about what young writers, especially very young writers, have done, because we've all written things. But it's really nice that yours is, you remember yours, which is really good.
Yeah. No, just to change topic very, very quickly, because unfortunately it seems we're running a little bit low on time. But firstly, I wanted to say your answers so far have been so great, and I'm just having so much fun. I now me and Ollie wanted to have some even more fun, and this is something we do a lot with our friends at maybe pre-drinks before going out. It's something we call like poetry freestyle, where we're kind of we have our chat here. And for those watching it on YouTube, we'll have the text coming up, but we're going to create a poem together, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see if we'll see if my sleep deprived brain lets me actually do this. But yeah.
So I think what we'll do is we'll say it out loud for those listening on Spotify. We'll write it in the chat, and then we can kind of work on it together. I think the pitch that we had, the only thing that we kind of prepared was a mini pitch. We're going to do maybe a poem around mental health, potentially compare stars to thoughts.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
So I'll start. I wrote the first line already. We don't need any kind of rhyme scheme or any kind of
be blind first. Control. Yeah.
Very, very free. So I'll start. Our minds are galaxies.
Okay.
Maybe Ollie goes next, and then Nikita, you can do 2 more verses or lines.
I'll go next. So we're doing mental health, right? So I do when we cry, stars cry with us.
When we break, we fall like shooting stars. Ever shining. No, not ever shining.
It doesn't need to be perfect or anything.
No. It doesn't need to make sense. Okay. We are the butterflies of this cosmos.
Okay, I think I'll go with something like, when we watch the stars, we watch ourselves.
I'm just trying to. I'm doing something like, I remember when we watched the stars together, but I'm trying to get that perspective of how we were watching them, and we're both watching each other, and now it's like we're almost together. I remember when we were together watching them.
Oh yeah, I got it. Through black holes and supernovas.
Okay, brilliant. Just for those listening on Spotify, watching on YouTube, this will probably be clipped up a bit. So in reality, this took longer than how you're watching it now, just so that you don't think it's super quick or anything. But yeah, let me start this up, because otherwise we'll have people watching all day as we try and come up with this. I think what we'll do is just about like 2 lines each more. So I'll do 2, then Ollie will do 2, and then you can do 2.
Amazing.
Okay, brilliant. Let me think. Okay, so like, each star a thought in the vast expanse, constellations like a conscious trance. Okay, Ollie, you've got one now.
Yeah, we're getting onto the rhyming now. Let me have a think. Guide my way, don't flicker so. The light you shine is all I know.
So let the universe in you find the universe in me. And together, let's seek out what would truly make us free. There we go.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Wow.
That was so much. Do you think you'd be able to read it all from the beginning to the end
Should
for us?
I,
Just
should I do the thing?
bring that together, and then we can. Yeah, just read the whole thing, and let's see how it sounds
All
as
right,
a poem, and see how well we did.
Should I? Would it help if I wrote it down in one message and then put it into like stanzas, or are you fine to read it as
I
it
got
is?
this. Okay. Our minds are galaxies. When we cry, stars cry with us. When we break, we fall like shooting stars. We are the butterflies of this cosmos. When we watch the stars, we watch ourselves. I remember when we were together, watching the stars from below, through black holes and supernovas. The tapestry of the night sky matches the tapestry of our minds. Each star a thought in the vast expanse. Constellations like a conscious trance. Guide my way, don't flicker so. The light you shine is all I know. So let the universe in you find the universe in me. And together, let's seek out what would truly make us free. That's the one. That was really fun.
Amazing. That was fun. Yeah,
Thank you.
That was so much fun. Yeah, writing about the universe is a really good one, isn't it? Because all of my work is about that. So, thank you for that.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much. That was really fun.
Oh, okay. Well, unfortunately, I think that's going to be all the time we have. But I wanted to say, Nikita, thank you so much for joining us. It was such fun. Thank you for your answers. Really, really insightful. Ollie, did you enjoy the interview?
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Lucas. And thank you, Nikita, so much for coming on. It's been amazing.
It was so nice to talk to both of you. And I really enjoyed writing that poem at the end with you. So thank you for that.
No worries. Thank you so much. So I'm afraid we're going to have to close off. Thank you, Nikita Gill, for joining us on today's episode. This is the LOAF Podcast. Ollie, signing off.